currency interventions to prop up the dollar. In 1961, the ESF began intervening in the foreign exchange market. However, there were some problems. By 1962, the ESF had committed much of its resources through the provision of foreign aid, wasting them funding covert operations. The IMF was also drained of most of its gold and dollars. Remember that the ESF's desperate dollar defense is to hide this fact to begin with. Anyhow, the Federal Reserve System's resources were quickly recruited to supplement the dollar's defense, and the Fed gave up whatever was left of its independence without much of a fight. Unfortunately for the ESF, it had another problem. The way central banks defend their currencies is by selling off their foreign reserves, and the ESF did not have any foreign currencies on hand, so the Treasury used a variety of strategies to come up with the foreign currencies it needed. It got West Germany to prepay its World War II debt. The Treasury also borrowed to get the money it needed, using a series of special Treasury bond sales to foreign governments. These were called Rosa bonds. They were denominated in foreign currencies and were part of America's national debt. The ESF also entered into a network of swap agreements with other central banks. Currency swaps are a derivative instrument that allow irresponsible central banks to temporarily prop up their currencies by racking up large amounts of foreign debt. The ESF used these swaps because they hid what it was doing. For example, it doesn't look like the US is borrowing anything here, does it? Still another way the ESF got foreign currencies was by using the IMF. The IMF was a great help in defending the dollar. However, explaining how these IMF loans work is complicated, but it adds up to this: more foreign-denominated debt hidden from the American people. Through all these different types of arrangements, the United States armed itself with the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of major foreign currencies it needed to defend the dollar. Gambling in derivative markets. Because so much of its resources were tied up, the ESF intervened mainly in the forwards market. Despite all its stratagems to come up with foreign currencies, the Treasury simply didn't have enough to defend the dollar, so it sold foreign currencies it didn't yet have through forward transactions. By promising to sell these currencies in the future, the Treasury encouraged individuals to hold dollar-denominated assets. When the dollar for future delivery sells at a substantial discount, it implies that holders have doubts about its value, and weakness in the dollar may induce foreigners to move their money elsewhere. So every time a foreign currency traded at a premium to the dollar, the ESF entered into millions worth of forward contracts. All these forward commitments carried the risk of loss if the dollar did not appreciate. For example, when the Treasury was selling all these forward marks, it was gambling that the price of the mark would drift lower, and the ESF eventually lost big time on its forward bets. Forwards are also a type of derivative, the same complicated financial bets that have fueled the mess over the last few years. And 50 years ago, long before Wall Street even knew what they were, the ESF was dealing in massive quantities of these risky bets. The London Gold Pool. Another arrangement made to bolster the world's monetary system against collapse was the London Gold Pool. Formed in late 1961, it was a device to halt the raids on gold and give the dollar the appearance of strength. The Exchange Stabilization Fund was used to participate in the gold pool, and the US supplied 59% of the gold sold in London. The United States never officially acknowledged taking part in this pool. However, this very real international gold pool kept the London free market stable, temporarily during the 60s. So the ESF has a history of international conspiracy, deceiving the world. This Wall Street Journal article shows the ESF's attitude towards the truth. In this business, you have to choose between lying to people or scaring them to death. The ESF's choice is clear: to lie. This lying is squarely in the public interest. To give the world a glimpse at the raw figures for a single day's actual gold outflow could prove disastrous. Debasing statistics. The ESF is ever more shrewdly guarding the dollar's value abroad through little-known techniques that range from double-counting gold bars to tinkering with the maturities of otherwise routine government securities. The result is a web of statistics that mask almost as much as they display. Even a prominent financier who helped create the government's dollar defenses confesses that he can't tell anymore what our balance of payment trend is. The ESF had arrangements with the IMF that made the gold stock look healthier than it really was. Only a fleeting footnote brought the ESF's double counting of gold bars to light. For ESF officials anxious to put the best face on figures, nothing is too absurd, including selling government debt with the odd maturity of 1 year and 2 days. This dishonesty was centered in the Treasury at the ESF. Even the massive currency swaps the Fed has with other central banks are carefully constructed to avoid statistical injuries. Since the 1960s, the dodges have only become more artful.
What if it's true, as Kevin Phillips recently stated in an article in Harper's, that ever since the 1960s, Washington has gulled its citizens and creditors by debasing official statistics, the vital instruments with which the vigor and muscle of the American economy are measured?
Propaganda. Statistical nonsense was only the beginning. In defense of the dollar, the ESF unleashed the mighty Wurlitzer. Every propaganda pitch was used to promote confidence in the dollar. Whenever the value of the dollar came under question, this propaganda took over, to convince us that losing money is good for us. It was in the 60s that the ESF's favorite bit of propaganda was born: the danger of deflation. Americans were told to worry less about the outflow of US gold, and instead worry about worldwide deflation. This was pure ESF propaganda. Deflation signifies a general decline in prices, and it hasn't happened in the United States since the ESF's creation. So right when the ESF was in the middle of this desperate dollar defense, there was a flood of articles like these, warning that the dollar might magically go up in value. Two things have happened since the 1960s. The dollar has lost nearly all its value, and the articles warning about deflation have gotten louder and louder in volume. Today we've reached a point where every Wall Street economist is looking for the arrival of a great deflation. Two things to take away from this are: 1. The loudness of the deflation propaganda gives a good idea of the ESF's level of control over US media. 2. As long as the ESF is in charge of defending the dollar, the chance of any real deflation is nil. Corrupting economics. Classic economics teaches that government deficit spending leads to inflation. This was the dominant view before the 1960s. Heavy deficits made for inflation. Heavy government spending ruins the dollar. This fundamental truth was acknowledged by everyone, and it was a threat to the ESF. You see, in the 60s, when the ESF was spreading deflation propaganda and doing everything in its power to boost confidence in the dollar, articles like this one appeared in the press. If we are safe in all this spending, what are we waiting for? Why don't we double the national debt and everyone gets rich? Anyone can promise to speed up the printing presses. Does this bring happiness and security? We all grow progressively poorer as the dollar's value declines, and declining currencies follow the law of physical bodies. They accelerate as they fall. It should be obvious why the US Treasury did not like classic economics. As part of its dollar defense, the ESF used its network of American academics to promote a new set of rules for managing the economy. This new theory of fiscal management called for planned treasury deficits to lead America to prosperity on a permanent basis and make recessions obsolete. It was called Keynesian economics, and the 1960s were a pivotal decade in the shift from classic to Keynesian economics. Of course, this Keynesian economics was nonsense. The reality is that governments that overspend face global and epidemical forces from the outside that no amount of mystic theory can avoid or kick down into the deep freeze. When anybody proposes cradle-to-the-grave disbursements by the US Treasury that somehow sound free, our misinformation becomes complete. The Academy Award-winning 2010 documentary, Inside Job, shows how the study of economics has been completely corrupted.
The financial industry also exerts its influence in a more subtle way, one that most Americans don't know about. It has corrupted the study of economics itself.
Arm-twisting pro-US governments. By 1960, the world was filled with pro-US states as a result of the CIA's actions. Although this was done initially simply to fight the Cold War, the ESF turned to these countries for support in defending the dollar. You see, foreign purchases of US securities weren't left entirely to chance. Foreign governments were coaxed into investing in the dollar in the most statistically smoothing way. In other words, the ESF went back to all the fascists, militarists, and murderers it supported, and through some arm twisting got them to help defend the dollar. These CIA-installed regimes started accumulating more dollars in their official reserves than they actually needed. The Treasury also began to pressure these pro-US states to buy weapons, since purchases of military wares helped to defend the dollar. Take Japan, for example, who was recruited to help save the dollar in 1968. Japan agreed to aid the dollar by purchasing Treasury securities and increasing its purchases of American arms. Since then, Japan's reserves have skyrocketed, and Japan remains one of the top 10 buyers of US weapons. With 70% of all sales, America now runs a global weapons monopoly. Don't think for a second that that's an accident. The IMF and World Bank seek repayment on their phony loans. The 1960s also witnessed another type of revolution, the empowerment of the World Bank and the IMF. If you remember, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created by the ESF to help finance covert operations. Under the cover of foreign aid, they made billions of, quote, loans to fund CIA activities. Well, in the 60s, the ESF started trying to collect on all these phony loans. This is outlined in the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. The ESF used highly paid professionals who cheated countries around the world to get the loans repaid. These economic hitmen used draconian techniques to get the IMF and World Bank their money back. Their tools for getting their way were even nastier, and when these economic hitmen failed to get leaders to comply,
the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders, and if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then we send in the military.
President Kennedy disagrees with the ESF. Although the ESF had an extraordinary amount of power, there was one person that was supposed to be able to control it, the President of the United States. And when the ESF was beginning its desperate dollar defense, the President of the United States was John F. Kennedy. Now, it was no secret that the Treasury and President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors had been engaged in a running battle over the best way to defend the dollar. The divisions within the American government followed habitual lines. The Treasury Department, specifically Secretary Douglas Dillon and Undersecretary Robert V. Rosa, advocated rather limited changes in international financial arrangements. It is no surprise that the Treasury resisted monetary reform. You'd expect the guy selling Rosa bonds to reject the idea of scrapping the existing system. On the other side, you had President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, the State Department, and the White House staff, who wanted radical new international mechanism and far greater multilateral currency management. That would have been the end of Bretton Woods and the ESF-controlled monetary system. For the first 2.5 years of Kennedy's presidency, the view of the Treasury prevailed. But in the middle of 1963, JFK stopped listening to the Treasury. President Kennedy swung more closely to the views held by his Council of Economic Advisors. Monetary reform was winning support. Then in August 1963, JFK came publicly to accept the idea that the United States had to join in the creation of a new international financial machinery. This was a radical change. 2 months later, in October, the President won a standing ovation for declaring that the United States will support any needed measures to increase international liquidity. Widespread support seemed to be developing for an overhaul of the world's currency system, and President Kennedy was about to expose the ESF's secrets to the world, sending important people at the Treasury to jail, the same people who, through the Secret Service, were in charge of defending his life. 1 month later, President Kennedy died, killed by a magic bullet. And when JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, ran for president, he died. Even JFK's son also died. The Kennedy curse. There was one good thing stemming from the death of President Kennedy, and that's the fact that monetary reform died with him. Ambitious plans to remake the world's monetary system never got off the ground. This disappointed the State Department, the Council of Economic Advisors, and a large number of academic economists. And it was a triumph for Robert Rosa, the manager of the Treasury's ESF.